My daughter sent me on a cruise to rest. Then I found my husband with her mother-in-law. I didn't want to go. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I'd share. And if you, for even a second, feel like this sounds familiar, please just leave a like and subscribe. It'll help me keep sharing these stories. The Mother's Day envelope felt heavier than it should have. Emily placed it in my weathered hands with that practiced smile I'd learned to recognize over the years, the one that meant she'd already made decisions for me. The cruise tickets inside were glossy, expensive-looking, with images of pristine decks and couples dancing under starlit skies. "You deserve to rest, Mom," she said, her manicured fingers smoothing the edges of the envelope. "It's just 5 days. The ocean air will be good for you." Her voice carried that tone I'd heard her use with her own children when convincing them that vegetables tasted good or that bedtime was actually fun. I sat in my worn velvet armchair, the one George always complained made me look too settled, holding those tickets like they might burn through my palms. The living room around us felt suddenly unfamiliar, as if someone had shifted all the furniture just slightly to the left. Dust motes danced in the afternoon light streaming through windows I'd cleaned just that morning. Windows that overlooked the garden I'd tended for 23 years. "But George," I started, my voice barely above a whisper. I gestured toward the kitchen where my husband of 41 years was supposedly reviewing insurance papers, though I could hear the television's muffled commentary of a baseball game. Emily's eyes flickered, just for a moment, with something I couldn't quite name. Impatience? Relief? "Dad needs some time to himself, Mom. You know how he's been lately. Stressed about retirement, his health." She trailed off, rearranging the throw pillows on the couch with unnecessary precision. I didn't ask why George wasn't coming with me. I didn't ask why Emily insisted on driving me to the port herself instead of letting George take me. I didn't ask why she'd booked me a solo cabin when we'd always traveled together before. After 63 years of being the good daughter, the good wife, the good mother, I had learned that asking questions made people uncomfortable. Questions suggested doubt, and doubt suggested I wasn't grateful enough for their thoughtfulness. So I nodded. I forced my lips into what I hoped resembled appreciation. I thanked my daughter for her generosity, even as something cold settled in my chest like a stone dropping into still water. The next morning, Emily arrived precisely at 8:30, her Honda SUV idling in our driveway. Through the kitchen window, I watched her check her phone repeatedly, fingers tapping against the steering wheel with barely concealed urgency. George emerged from his shower wearing the cologne I'd bought him for Christmas, the expensive kind he usually saved for special occasions. He kissed my cheek with lips that felt strangely cold, his familiar morning stubble scratching against my skin. "Have a wonderful time, Margaret," he said, using my full name instead of the Maggie he'd called me since our second date. His hands rested briefly on my shoulders, but they felt distant, like he was steadying a stranger. I studied his face, the face I'd memorized over 4 decades of marriage. The same blue eyes that had twinkled when he proposed in Central Park, the same crooked smile that had charmed me at our neighbor's barbecue in 1982. But something was different. His gaze wouldn't quite meet mine, sliding away toward the newspaper folded on the counter, the coffee maker's red brewing light, anywhere but my questioning eyes. "Take care of yourself," I whispered, smoothing the collar of his shirt, a gesture I'd performed thousands of times before. My fingers lingered on the fabric, memorizing the texture, the warmth of his skin beneath. Emily honked twice. Short, sharp sounds that cut through the morning air like accusations. The drive to the port passed in a blur of forced conversation about weather, about the ship's amenities, about how I should try the seafood buffet. Emily's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, her knuckles white against the black leather. She kept glancing at me through the rearview mirror, her expression unreadable behind designer sunglasses that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. At the terminal, she hugged me goodbye with arms that felt somehow apologetic. "Call me when you get settled," she said, already stepping backward toward her car. "And Mom?" She paused, one hand on the door handle. "Just try to enjoy yourself. Really enjoy yourself." I stood on the dock, my small suitcase at my feet, watching her silver SUV disappear into the maze of departure traffic. Around me, couples checked in together, laughing, planning their days, sharing the excitement of adventure. I felt like a widow among newlyweds, invisible and out of place. The cabin was neat, clean, and devastatingly empty. A king-size bed meant for two, a balcony with 2 chairs, champagne service for 2 guests. I sat on the edge of the mattress, my hands folded in my lap, and stared at the ocean stretching endlessly beyond my window. For the first time in decades, I was completely alone. No one needed me to cook dinner, to pick up prescriptions, to remember anniversaries or doctor's appointments. No one required my attention, my service, my careful management of their comfort. The silence felt like drowning. That first night, I ate alone in the dining room, surrounded by families and couples sharing stories and making plans. The waiter, a kind young man with gentle eyes, asked if I was waiting for someone. No, I said quietly. Just me. He didn't ask again. I went to bed early and cried into the pillow so softly I thought even the ocean wouldn't hear, but it did. The waves seemed to echo my loneliness back through the cabin walls, a rhythm that matched the ache in my chest where questions I couldn't voice were growing larger and more insistent with each passing hour. The second day on the ship, I found myself in the library staring at a photo album I'd packed at the last minute. The leather cover was worn smooth from years of handling, and inside, our life unfolded in carefully preserved moments. There was Emily's graduation from NYU, George and me beaming with pride as she accepted her diploma in business administration. There was our 25th anniversary dinner at that little Italian restaurant in Brooklyn, where George had surprised me with a necklace I'd admired months earlier. But as I turned each page, a different story began emerging. In every photo where I appeared, I was serving someone else. Cutting Emily's birthday cake while she posed for the camera, adjusting George's tie before his promotion ceremony, standing behind them, smiling, supporting, enabling their moments to shine while I remained carefully positioned in the background. I closed the album and walked to the ship's deck, where the Atlantic Ocean stretched endlessly in all directions. The salt air stung my eyes, or maybe that was something else entirely. How many times had I put their needs before my own? The question surfaced like a bubble rising from deep water, impossible to ignore once it reached the surface. There was the time Emily needed help with her first apartment deposit. I'd given her the money I'd been saving for that art class I'd wanted to take. Watercolor painting at the community center. "It's just a hobby, Mom," George had said when I mentioned it. "Emily's future is more important." I'd nodded, written the check, and never mentioned the art class again. When George's mother developed dementia, I'd been the one to move her into our spare bedroom. For 3 years, I'd managed her medications, helped her dress, cleaned up accidents, and listened to her call me by his ex-girlfriend's name. Emily visited twice a month, bringing flowers and staying for exactly 1 hour. George worked longer hours, claiming the situation at home was too stressful for him to handle. I'd handle it. I always handled it. After his mother passed, George had looked at me with something that might have been gratitude and said, "I don't know how you did it, Maggie. You're stronger than I am." But he'd never offered to take turns with the night shifts, never volunteered to miss his golf games to help with doctor's appointments. The spare bedroom had become George's home office within a week of the funeral. I remembered the conversation we'd had about our retirement savings just 6 months ago. George had spread the financial statements across our dining room table like evidence in a trial. "We need to be more careful with spending," he'd announced, his reading glasses perched on his nose as he highlighted numbers with a yellow marker. "Maybe you could cut back on some of your activities," he'd suggested delicately. My activities. The $20 a month I spent on yarn for the baby blankets I donated to the hospital, the $15 monthly fee for the senior center's book club, the occasional lunch with Janet, my only remaining friend from the old neighborhood. Meanwhile, George's golf membership cost us $300 monthly. His subscription to financial magazines and his premium cable sports package added another $100. But those weren't activities. Those were necessities for his mental health, his professional development, his well-being. I'd nodded and promised to be more mindful of my expenses. The pattern had been there for years, decades even. But I'd been too busy managing everyone else's happiness to notice how systematically my own had been eroded. Like a coastline slowly claimed by rising tides, my identity had disappeared so gradually that I hadn't recognized the theft until I was standing on this ship, surrounded by ocean, with nothing familiar left to anchor me. Emily had learned well from her father. When she'd gotten married 5 years ago, I'd spent weeks preparing for the wedding. I'd addressed every invitation by hand because Emily wanted them to look personal and elegant. I'd spent hours on the phone with vendors, coordinating details that should have been handled by the wedding planner we'd already paid. I'd even altered my own mother-of-the-bride dress 3 times because Emily kept changing her mind about the color scheme. The night before the wedding, exhausted and overwhelmed, I'd asked Emily if there was anything special she wanted me to do during the ceremony. She'd looked at me blankly for a moment before saying, "Just, don't cry too much, okay? It'll ruin the photos. Don't cry too much at my own daughter's wedding." At the reception, I'd watched Emily dance with her new husband, with George, with her college friends, with her boss from the marketing firm where she'd just been promoted. She'd thanked everyone in her speech: her wedding planner, her hairdresser, her college roommate who'd flown in from California. She'd forgotten to mention me. George had patted my hand when he noticed my expression. "She's just overwhelmed," he'd whispered. "You understand." I always understood. The cruise ship's dining room filled with the dinner crowd as evening approached. I sat alone at a table for 2, the empty chair across from me serving as a monument to my solitude. Around me, families shared stories of their day's adventures. A couple at the next table was planning their shore excursions, debating between a wine-tasting tour and a historical walking tour. "What do you think, honey?" the woman asked her husband. "Which one sounds more fun to you?" He considered seriously, consulted a brochure, asked about her preferences. They negotiated like partners, like equals. When was the last time George had asked my opinion about anything more significant than what to have for dinner? I tried to remember the last time he'd surprised me with something I actually wanted, rather than something he thought I should want. The last birthday gift had been a new vacuum cleaner, the one with the extra attachments you mentioned, he'd said proudly. I hadn't mentioned any vacuum cleaner. I'd mentioned wanting to take a weekend trip to see the fall foliage in Vermont, but apparently he hadn't been listening. Emily's gifts had become increasingly practical over the years, too. Dish towels, a slow cooker, gift cards to the grocery store. Nothing that suggested she saw me as a person with interests beyond maintaining their household comfort. My phone buzzed with a text message from Emily. "Hope you're having fun, Mom. Dad says the house feels so peaceful without your constant fussing around. Maybe this break is good for both of you." Constant fussing. 41 years of marriage reduced to constant fussing. I stared at the message until the words blurred together. When had caring become fussing? When had love become annoyance? When had I become a burden to the people I'd dedicated my life to supporting? The woman at the next table laughed at something her husband said, the sound genuine and warm. She reached across to squeeze his hand, and he lifted their joined fingers to his lips for a gentle kiss. I watched them with the fascination of an anthropologist studying a foreign culture. That night, I lay in the too large bed and let myself think the unthinkable. Was I used? The question hung in the darkness above me like a storm cloud. I'd been the one to sacrifice my career ambitions when Emily was born, staying home to provide stability while George climbed the corporate ladder. I'd been the one to manage every detail of our domestic life, freeing him to focus on important work. I'd been the one to care for his aging parents, plan our social calendar, remember every birthday and anniversary. And what had I received in return? A husband who found my presence annoying, a daughter who saw me as a service provider rather than a person, a life so thoroughly dedicated to others that I'd forgotten I was supposed to exist within it too. The ship rocked gently as I finally fell asleep, my dreams filled with images of empty chairs and forgotten names, of hands that reached for help but found only air. The ship's engine failure happened on the 4th day, just as I was beginning to adjust to the strange rhythm of solitude. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom at 6 a.m, apologizing for the mechanical issues that would require an early return to port. Passengers groaned in the hallways, complaining about shortened vacations and disrupted plans. I felt nothing but relief. The idea of returning home a day early filled me with something I hadn't expected. Anticipation. Maybe George would be surprised to see me. Maybe we could order takeout from that Chinese place we used to love, sit on the couch, and I could tell him about the dolphins I'd seen from the deck. Maybe Emily would stop by, and we could laugh about my short-lived cruise adventure. Maybe I could pretend I hadn't spent 4 days questioning everything I thought I knew about my life. I didn't call ahead. Some impulse I couldn't name made me want to surprise them, to walk through our front door and see George's face light up with genuine pleasure at my unexpected return. I imagined him rising from his reading chair, arms open, saying something like, "Maggie, I missed you more than I expected." The taxi dropped me off at the end of our driveway at 2:30 in the afternoon. Our house looked exactly the same white shutters I'd painted last spring, the same rose bushes I'd pruned in March, the same welcome mat I'd bought because it said "Home is where love lives" in cheerful yellow letters. But something felt different as I walked up the brick path. The living room curtains were drawn, unusual for George, who liked natural light for his afternoon reading. Emily's car wasn't in the driveway, but there was an unfamiliar silver Mercedes parked where she usually left her Honda. I fumbled with my keys, the metal slippery in my suddenly sweaty palms. The lock turned with its familiar click, and I stepped into the entryway, dragging my small suitcase behind me. That's when I heard it. Laughter. High, musical, completely unfamiliar female laughter echoing from our living room. Not Emily's laugh. I would have recognized that immediately. This was different. Sophisticated. Confident. The kind of laugh that belonged to someone who had never doubted her place in the world. I stood frozen in my own entryway, my heart beginning to pound with a rhythm that felt dangerous. Through the archway that led to our living room, I could see movement. Shadows shifting on the wall. The sound of ice clinking in glasses. My feet moved without my permission, carrying me forward until I could see into the room where George and I had spent thousands of evenings together, where we'd watched Emily take her first steps, where we'd argued about finances and made up over shared bowls of ice cream, where I'd folded laundry while he watched the news, our comfortable silence filling the space between us like a familiar blanket. George was there, sitting on our burgundy sofa, the one we'd saved for 3 years to afford. He was wearing the blue shirt I'd ironed for him on Sunday, the one that brought out his eyes. His hair was freshly combed, and he'd shaved more carefully than he had in months. And beside him, curled into the corner of our couch like she belonged there, was Linda Morrison, my son-in-law's mother, Emily's mother-in-law, the woman who had made passive-aggressive comments about my cooking at every family gathering for 5 years. The woman who wore too much perfume and too much jewelry and had opinions about everything from my choice of wall paint to my outdated hairstyle. She was wearing my bathrobe, my pale blue terry cloth robe with the small coffee stain near the pocket that I'd never been able to completely remove. The robe George had given me for our 10th anniversary, back when he still noticed what I liked. Linda had the belt tied tight around her thin waist, and she was laughing at something George had just said, her manicured hand resting on his forearm with casual intimacy. On the coffee table between them were 2 wine glasses, the good crystal ones we saved for holidays. An open bottle of the expensive Chardonnay George had been saving for a special occasion. Crackers and cheese arranged on the silver platter my mother had given us as a wedding gift. They looked comfortable, natural, like they'd done this many times before. I stood there in the archway, dripping rainwater from my coat onto the hardwood floors I'd mopped just days earlier, and watched my husband with another woman in my home, using my things, drinking my wine, sitting in my space. Linda saw me first. Her laugh died mid-note, and her face went through a series of expressions that would have been comical under different circumstances. Surprise, guilt, and then, impossibly, a small smile that looked almost satisfied. "Oh," she said, her voice honey-sweet with false concern. "Margaret, you're back early." George's head snapped toward me so fast I heard his neck crack. The color drained from his face, leaving him pale and suddenly fragile-looking. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again like a fish gasping for air. "Maggie," he said finally, my nickname sounding foreign in his mouth. We weren't expecting you until tomorrow." I couldn't speak. My throat had closed completely, and my hands were shaking so violently that my keys slipped from my fingers and clattered to the floor. The sound echoed in the sudden silence like coins dropped into a wishing well. Linda adjusted the robe, my robe, pulling it more securely around herself. George was just keeping me company, she said, her tone suggesting this was the most natural thing in the world. David and Emily are both so busy with work. We were just talking, on my couch, in my robe, drinking my wine. George stood up slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. "Let me explain," he said, taking a step toward me. "It's not what it looks like." But it was exactly what it looked like. I could see it in the way Linda's lipstick had left a faint mark on the rim of her wine glass, in the way George's hair was slightly mussed on one side, in the way they both looked guilty but not particularly sorry. I bent to pick up my keys, my movements mechanical and strange. When I straightened, both of them were staring at me with expressions I couldn't read, waiting to see what I would do, waiting to see if I would make a scene or quietly disappear. I'd spent 63 years being the one who didn't make scenes. "I see," I said, my voice coming out as barely a whisper. George took another step closer. "Maggie, please, let's talk about this rationally." Rationally. As if there was a rational explanation for finding your husband entertaining another woman in your home while you were supposed to be safely away on a cruise. As if 41 years of marriage could be rationally explained away by whatever story he was preparing to tell. I looked at Linda, still wearing my robe, still sitting on my couch. She had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable now, but there was something else in her eyes, something that looked almost like triumph. "How long?" I asked, the question falling out of my mouth before I could stop it. George and Linda exchanged a glance, quick but not quick enough for me to miss. "It's not like that," George said, but his voice lacked conviction. I picked up my suitcase and turned toward the door. Behind me, I heard George call my name, heard his footsteps following me, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. If I stopped, if I turned around, if I let him explain, I might disappear entirely. Outside, the rain had started again, coming down in cold sheets that soaked through my coat within seconds. I walked without direction, my suitcase wheels catching on cracks in the sidewalk, my feet moving automatically while my mind struggled to process what I'd just witnessed. 4 blocks from my house, I found myself at a bus stop sitting on the metal bench in the rain. My phone buzzed with a text from George. "Please come home. We need to talk." Another buzz. From Emily. Dad called. "Mom, please don't overreact. Just come home and let's discuss this like adults. Don't overreact. Don't make a scene. Don't be difficult." I turned off my phone and sat in the rain, watching cars pass by, each one carrying people who had homes to go to, people who belonged somewhere, people whose husbands weren't entertaining other women in their bathrobes while they were away. For the first time in my life, I had nowhere to go. I spent that first night at the Comfort Inn on Route 9, paying for a room with the emergency credit card I'd forgotten was still in my wallet. The room smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and other people's disappointments. I sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing my damp clothes, staring at my phone as it buzzed with increasingly desperate messages. "George, Maggie, please, you're being irrational. Come home so we can talk like mature adults." Emily, "Mom, you're scaring me." Dad explained everything. "You're making this bigger than it needs to be." Emily again. "Linda says you looked upset. She's worried about you too. We all are." Linda was worried about me. The woman who'd been drinking wine in my living room, wearing my bathrobe, was worried about me. By morning, my phone had 17 missed calls and 23 text messages. I read them all, each one carefully crafted to make me feel like the problem. Like I was the one creating drama where none existed. Like my pain was an inconvenience to everyone else. Emily arrived at my hotel room at 8 a.m. sharp. I heard her voice in the hallway, arguing with someone at the front desk about visitor policies. When she knocked, her fist pounded against the door with the authoritative rhythm of someone who was used to getting what she wanted. "Mom, I know you're in there. Open up. We need to talk." I opened the door, and Emily pushed past me into the small room, her perfectly styled hair and designer blazer making the space look even more shabby and desperate. She surveyed my unmade bed, my suitcase still zipped and sitting on the floor, my tear-swollen face, and I watched her expression shift from concern to something that looked almost like disgust. "Mom, what are you doing?" This is insane. She gestured around the room like I'd chosen to live in a crack house instead of a perfectly respectable budget hotel. You can't just run away because you saw Dad and Linda having coffee. Coffee. She was calling it coffee now. They were drinking wine, I said quietly. At 2:30 in the afternoon, she was wearing my bathrobe. Emily's jaw tightened slightly. So what? Maybe she spilled something on her clothes. Maybe Dad was being a good host while she waited for David to pick her up. There are 100 innocent explanations. I stared at my daughter, this woman I'd raised and sacrificed for and loved unconditionally, and tried to understand when she'd learned to lie so smoothly, when she'd developed this talent for rewriting reality to suit her needs. Emily, I said carefully, your father and I have been married for 41 years. I know the difference between hostess hospitality and whatever I walked in on. She sank into the room's single chair with an exasperated sigh. Mom, listen to me. Really listen. Dad has been lonely since you've been pulling away from him. You've been so focused on your own problems, your own needs, that you haven't noticed how isolated he's been feeling. My own problems, my own needs. I tried to remember the last time I'd expressed a need that didn't involve serving someone else. The last time I'd had problems that anyone in my family had cared about. What problems? I asked. Emily rolled her eyes. The constant complaining about your health, the way you've been moody and difficult lately. Dad says you barely talk to him anymore unless it's to criticize something he's done. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. This was a George I didn't recognize, one who apparently discussed our marriage with our daughter, who painted me as some kind of nagging shrew. When had I ever criticized him? When had I ever been difficult? I don't complain about my health, I said, my voice getting smaller despite my efforts to sound strong. The arthritis in your hands, the way you groan when you get up from chairs, the constant doctor's appointments. Emily ticked these off on her fingers like evidence in a prosecution. Mom, you're 63 years old. You need to accept that some things change and stop making everyone else responsible for your emotional well-being. The arthritis in my hands. From 40 years of cooking, cleaning, washing, and caring for everyone else. The groaning when I got up. From decades of putting everyone's comfort before my own physical needs. The doctor's appointments. For the high blood pressure that developed from years of swallowing my feelings, and the back problems from sleeping on the couch whenever George wanted extra space in bed. Linda understands what Dad's going through, Emily continued, her voice taking on the patient tone she used when explaining obvious things to slow children. She's been through a difficult marriage, too. She knows what it's like to feel unappreciated. Unappreciated. George felt unappreciated. What exactly does your father feel unappreciated for? I asked. Emily looked at me like I'd asked her to explain gravity. Mom, he's worked his entire life to provide for us. He's given you a beautiful home, financial security, a comfortable retirement, and instead of being grateful, you nitpick. You make him feel guilty for wanting to enjoy his life. I tried to remember a single instance of nitpicking. A single time I'd made George feel guilty for anything. The only guilt I'd ever seen from him was when he forgot our anniversary 3 years running. And even then, I'd been the one to apologize for making him feel bad about forgetting. Linda appreciates him, Emily said. And there was something in her voice that made my blood freeze. She sees his good qualities. She makes him laugh. How long has this been going on? I asked. Emily's expression shifted again, this time to something that looked almost like pity. Mom, there's nothing going on. They're friends. Adult friends who enjoy each other's company. The fact that you immediately assume something sordid says more about your state of mind than it does about their friendship. The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that I almost believed her, almost convinced myself that I had misinterpreted what I'd seen, that my emotional reaction was evidence of my own instability, rather than a normal response to betrayal. Your father loves you, Emily continued, leaning forward with the earnest expression she'd perfected as a child when she wanted something. But he needs space to breathe. He needs to feel valued and appreciated, not constantly judged and criticized. I wanted to ask when I'd ever judged him, when I'd ever criticized him. But Emily was already standing, smoothing her skirt, checking her phone with the impatient gesture of someone who had more important places to be. Come home, Mom. Apologize to Dad and Linda for making them uncomfortable. Show some maturity. She paused at the door, her hand on the handle. And maybe think about whether you've been the kind of wife Dad deserves. After she left, I sat in the silence of that hotel room and tried to understand what had just happened. My daughter had somehow turned my discovery of my husband's betrayal into evidence of my own failures as a wife. She'd made Linda into the victim and me into the villain. She'd rewritten the entire narrative so that my pain became my fault. My phone rang. George this time. "Maggie, honey, please come home. Emily told me you're upset, and I understand why you might have misinterpreted what you saw." Misinterpreted. "There's nothing to misinterpret, George," I said, surprised by how tired my voice sounded. "Linda was just visiting because she was feeling lonely. David works such long hours, and she doesn't have many friends in the city. I was being neighborly." His voice carried the patient reasonableness of someone explaining simple concepts to a confused child. "Neighborly," I repeated. "I offered her a glass of wine to be polite. She spilled some on her blouse, so I gave her your robe until it dried. You would have done the same thing if you'd been here." Would I? Would I have offered another woman my bathrobe, settled her into my living room, shared wine with her in the middle of the afternoon? Would I have been so comfortable with another man that we'd look like a couple to anyone walking through the door? "The cruise was supposed to help you," George continued. "Emily thought you needed time to get some perspective on things, to remember what's important." The cruise. The manipulation was so complete, so total, that I felt dizzy trying to follow all the threads. They'd sent me away not for my benefit, but to clear the house for— what? How many afternoons had George and Linda spent on my couch, drinking my wine, laughing at my absence? "Come home, Maggie. Let's put this behind us and move forward." Move forward, as if nothing had happened. As if I hadn't just discovered that my family saw me as such an obstacle to their happiness, that they'd coordinated to remove me from my own life. "I need time to think," I said. "Don't overthink this," George replied quickly. "You know how you get when you overthink things. You blow everything out of proportion." How I get. As if having emotions was a character flaw I needed to manage better. That evening, David called. My son-in-law's voice was uncomfortable, embarrassed. "Margaret, I'm sorry about the confusion today. Mom can be a lot. I know she probably overstepped some boundaries." Finally, someone who acknowledged that Linda's behavior was inappropriate. "I've talked to her about being more considerate when she visits George," David continued. "She doesn't always think about how her actions might be perceived." Visits. Plural. This wasn't the first time. "David," I said carefully, "how often does your mother visit George?" There was a long pause. I'm not sure that's really my business to monitor. They're both adults." "How often?" I pressed. Another pause. "Margaret, I think you should probably discuss this with George directly." After I hung up, I sat in the gathering darkness of that hotel room and finally understood the scope of what had been done to me. This wasn't a single incident I'd stumbled upon. This was a systematic restructuring of my life that had been happening behind my back, with the knowledge and cooperation of my entire family. They hadn't just betrayed me, they'd erased me. On my third day at the Comfort Inn, I ran out of clean clothes. The thought of going home to retrieve more felt impossible, but I couldn't live in the same blouse and pants forever. I found myself in the hotel laundry room at 6 a.m., feeding quarters into machines that smelled like other people's desperation. That's where I met Rose. She was probably in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and hands that moved with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to make every motion count. She was folding what looked like a week's worth of laundry while humming something that might have been Patsy Cline. "Hotel living?" she asked, nodding toward my single load of clothes. "Something like that," I replied, not sure how to explain my situation to a stranger. Rose studied me with eyes that had clearly seen enough of life to recognize pain when they encountered it. Running from something or running to something? The question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on the running from part that I hadn't considered there might be a running to option. "I'm not sure there's anywhere to run to," I said honestly. Rose smiled, and it transformed her entire face. "Honey, there's always somewhere to run to. The trick is learning that you don't need anyone's permission to go there." She introduced herself as Rose Chen, recently moved to a senior living community after spending 2 years in a bitter divorce battle with her husband of 38 years. "Best decision I ever made," she said, snapping a towel straight with military precision. "Should have done it 20 years ago." "What made you finally leave?" I asked. Rose paused in her folding, her expression growing thoughtful. "The day I realized I was apologizing for existing in my own life. The day I understood that I'd become so small, so invisible, that I was practically haunting my own house." Her words hit me like cold water. Apologizing for existing. That's exactly what I'd been doing for years without recognizing it. "My daughter-in-law used to rearrange my kitchen when she came to visit," Rose continued. "Said she was helping me get organized. My husband would thank her afterward, never asking how I felt about strangers reorganizing my personal space. When I mentioned it bothered me, he'd say I was being territorial and ungrateful. I thought about Emily's constant suggestions for how I should rearrange my life, how I should feel, how I should react, how George had started thanking her for her good advice about handling your mother. One day I came home from grocery shopping and found her throwing away my spice collection," Rose said. 20 years of carefully collected herbs and seasonings, some of them from my mother's garden, going straight into the trash because she'd decided they were expired and taking up too much space. "What did you do?" I asked her to stop, politely, respectfully. Know what she said? Rose's voice grew harder. She said, "Rose, I'm only trying to help. You shouldn't be so attached to clutter at your age." The casual cruelty of it made my chest ache. My husband stood right there and said nothing. 38 years of marriage, and he couldn't defend my right to keep my own possessions in my own kitchen. Rose shook her head. That night, I started planning my exit. "Wasn't it scary?" I asked. "Starting over at our age?" Rose laughed, but it wasn't bitter. It was actually joyful, terrifying. But you know what was scarier? Spending whatever years I had left apologizing for taking up space in my own life. She helped me carry my laundry back to my room, and when I hesitated at the door, clearly not ready for the conversation to end, she invited herself in for coffee from the room's tiny machine. "Tell me," she said, settling into the uncomfortable chair like she planned to stay a while. So I did. I told her about the cruise, about finding George and Linda, about Emily's visit and the way my family had turned my pain into evidence of my character flaws. I told her about feeling erased, about questioning my own perceptions, about the growing certainty that I'd been systematically manipulated. Rose listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, her expression growing more serious as the story unfolded. "How long has George been making you feel crazy?" she asked when I finished. "What do you mean?" "The gaslighting. Making you question your own reality." "When did that start?" I tried to think. I don't know if he was doing it on purpose." Rose's expression softened. "Honey, intent doesn't matter when the result is that you can't trust your own judgment anymore. When did you start second-guessing yourself about everything?" The answer came slowly, painfully. A few years ago, maybe longer. When I started mentioning feeling lonely, he'd tell me I was being dramatic. When I said I felt taken for granted, he'd point out everything he provided for me. When I tried to talk about wanting more from our relationship, he'd say I was never satisfied. "And Emily? She learned from the best," I said, surprised by the bitterness in my own voice. Rose pulled out her phone and showed me photos of her new apartment. Bright, airy rooms filled with furniture she'd chosen herself, a kitchen organized exactly the way she wanted it, a garden balcony where she grew tomatoes and herbs. "This is what choosing yourself looks like," she said. "This is what happens when you stop asking permission to exist." That afternoon, Rose took me to lunch at a small cafe near the hotel, not to discuss my problems or analyze my situation, but simply to enjoy a meal with another human being who saw me as worth spending time with. We talked about books, about places we'd like to travel, about her ceramics classes and my abandoned dream of taking art lessons. "Why didn't you ever take those art classes?" she asked. I started to explain about Emily's apartment deposit, about George's mother's care needs, about all the legitimate reasons I'd had for postponing my own interests. But as the words came out, I heard them differently. They weren't reasons. They were excuses. Excuses I'd made for other people who'd never felt the need to postpone their own desires for mine. You could still take them, Rose said simply. I'm 63. So? I started ceramics at 71. Best thing I ever did for myself. After lunch, Rose took me to her bank. Not to do anything dramatic, just to show me something. I want you to see what financial independence looks like, she said as we sat in the parking lot outside First National Bank. When I filed for divorce, I discovered that my ex-husband had been controlling our finances in ways I hadn't even realized. I had access to credit cards, but not to the statements. I could spend money, but I couldn't see where our money was going or how much we actually had. She showed me her phone, pulling up a banking app that displayed her account balances in real time. This is my money, she said with quiet pride. I know exactly how much I have, where it goes, and how I want to spend it. No one else gets to make those decisions for me anymore. How did you manage the divorce financially? It was hard, Rose admitted. But you know what? I discovered I needed a lot less money than I thought I did when I wasn't supporting someone else's expensive lifestyle choices. When I wasn't paying for golf memberships and premium cable packages and expensive dinners out that I didn't even enjoy. That evening, alone in my hotel room, I did something I hadn't done in decades. I called the bank and asked for complete statements on all our accounts. Not just the joint checking account I used for groceries and household expenses, but everything. Savings, investments, retirement funds, credit cards. I'll need to verify your identity, the customer service representative said. And I should mention that some of these accounts may require joint authorization for information release. I'm asking about accounts with my name on them, I said firmly. Of course, Mrs. Morrison. Let me pull up your information. What I discovered made my hands shake so violently, I had to set the phone down twice during the call. George had been systematically moving money out of our joint accounts and into investment accounts that had only his name on them. Over the past 3 years, nearly $40,000 had been transferred from accounts we shared into accounts that belonged only to him. My Social Security checks, which were directly deposited into our joint account, had been redirected to a separate account I'd never known existed. The house, our house that I'd lived in for 23 years, that I'd maintained and improved and loved, was held in a trust that listed George as the primary beneficiary and me as a dependent resident. Ma'am? The bank representative's voice sounded concerned. Are you still there? Yes, I whispered. I'm here. Is there anything else I can help you with today? There was. There was so much I needed help with that I didn't know where to start. But for the first time in years, I knew I was going to ask for it. Can you transfer me to someone who can help me open my own account? I said. An account with only my name on it? Of course, Mrs. Morrison. Let me connect you with new accounts. As I waited on hold, I looked out the hotel window at the parking lot below. Ordinary people getting in and out of ordinary cars, going about ordinary lives where they probably didn't have to question whether they had the right to their own money. Rose was right. I'd been apologizing for existing in my own life, but I was done apologizing. The new accounts representative came on the line with a cheerful voice. Good evening, Mrs. Morrison. I understand you'd like to open a personal checking account. Yes, I said, and my voice sounded stronger than it had in years. I'd like to open an account that belongs only to me. Armed with bank statements and a clarity I hadn't felt in years, I made the call that would change everything. Family meeting, I told Emily when she answered her phone. Tonight, 7 o'clock. Your house. Mom, you sound different. Are you feeling better? Did you talk to Dad about... Emily. My voice cut through her practiced concern like a blade. 7 o'clock. Make sure David and Linda are there too. We're going to discuss some things that involve everyone. Linda? Mom, why would we need Linda there? She's not really family. She's family enough to drink wine in my living room wearing my bathrobe, I said. She's family enough to be part of whatever conversations you've all been having about my marriage behind my back. So she's family enough to be part of this conversation. The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought Emily might have hung up. Mom, she said finally, her voice taking on that careful tone she used when she thought I was being unreasonable. I think you're still upset about the misunderstanding with Dad and Linda. Maybe we should wait until you're feeling more rational. 7 o'clock, Emily. I hung up before she could respond. George tried calling me 6 times in the next hour. I let every call go to voicemail, then listened to them all at once. His voice progressed from concerned to frustrated to angry to something that sounded almost like panic. "Maggie, Emily says you're demanding some kind of family meeting. This is getting out of hand. You're embarrassing yourself and us. Please call me back so we can discuss this privately. Maggie, I don't know what you think you're accomplishing with this drama, but it needs to stop. Linda is mortified that you're involving her in our personal business. Maggie, if you're trying to punish me for being kind to a lonely woman, then you're being petty and cruel. This isn't like you. Isn't like me." He was right about that. At 6:30, I parked outside Emily's house in suburban Connecticut. The 2-story colonial with its perfectly manicured lawn and 3-car garage had always intimidated me slightly. Emily and David had bought it 5 years ago with help from both sets of parents, though George had been quick to point out that our contribution had been significantly smaller than Linda's. Through the living room windows, I could see them all gathered inside. George pacing near the fireplace, his hands gesturing emphatically as he spoke to someone I couldn't see. Emily sitting rigidly on her white sectional sofa, checking her phone repeatedly. David standing awkwardly near the kitchen doorway, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. And Linda, perched delicately on the edge of an armchair, wearing a black dress that was probably more expensive than my monthly grocery budget. I sat in my car for a moment, feeling the weight of 41 years of marriage, 35 years of motherhood, and 63 years of being the one who smoothed things over, who apologized, who made everyone else comfortable at the expense of her own peace. Rose's words echoed in my mind. "You don't need anyone's permission to exist." I walked up to Emily's front door and rang the bell like a visitor instead of using the key they'd given me years ago. Some gestures, I'd learned, carried meaning beyond their practical purpose. Emily opened the door with a smile that looked physically painful to maintain. "Mom, you look—" She paused, clearly struggling for words. I looked different, and I knew it. I'd spent an hour getting ready, choosing my clothes deliberately instead of grabbing whatever was convenient. A navy blue dress that George had once said brought out my eyes, before he'd stopped noticing my eyes at all. The pearl necklace my mother had left me, which I rarely wore because George said it looked old-fashioned. Low heels that made me stand taller, feel more substantial. "I look like myself," I said, stepping past her into the house. The living room fell silent as I entered. George stopped pacing and turned toward me, his expression cycling through surprise, relief, and something that might have been fear. David gave me an awkward wave from his position near the kitchen. Linda remained seated but straightened slightly, her posture becoming more defensive. "Maggie," George said, moving toward me with his arms slightly extended, as if he planned to embrace me. "I'm so glad you came. We've all been worried sick." I stepped sideways, avoiding his attempted hug, and walked to the center of the room. Emily's coffee table was covered with magazines arranged in perfect fan patterns, a bowl of decorative balls that served no purpose, and a candle that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a week. I placed my purse on that pristine table and pulled out a manila folder. "Please, everyone sit down," I said. "We have some things to discuss." Emily perched on the edge of her sofa like she was preparing to flee. David reluctantly moved closer but remained standing. George took a step toward me, then seemed to think better of it and sat heavily in the chair across from Linda. "Mom," Emily began, "before you say anything, I want you to know that we've all been talking, and we understand why you're upset. We're prepared to make some adjustments to help you feel more comfortable with Dad and Linda's friendship." Adjustments. As if my pain was a minor inconvenience that could be managed with the right accommodations. "Linda," I said, looking directly at her for the first time since I'd entered the room, "I want you to tell me, in your own words, what your relationship with my husband is." Linda's perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the way her face paled. She glanced at George, then at Emily, clearly looking for someone to rescue her from the question. "Margaret," she said carefully, "I think you're misunderstanding the nature of George's and my friendship. We're both at similar stages in our lives, dealing with similar challenges." "What challenges?" I interrupted. Another glance around the room. "Well, the challenges of being married to people who perhaps don't share our interests anymore. who've become set in their ways. Set in their ways. I was set in my ways for expecting my husband to be faithful, apparently. How long have you been discussing these challenges together? I asked. Mom, Emily interjected. I don't think this line of questioning is productive. We're all here because we care about you and want to help you through this difficult time. Answer the question, Linda. Linda's composure cracked slightly. I don't see how that's relevant. 6 months, George said suddenly. We've been friends for about 6 months. I opened my folder and pulled out the bank statements I'd printed that afternoon. George, in the last 6 months, you've spent $1,400 at restaurants that I've never been to. You've made cash withdrawals totaling $3,000 from our joint account with no record of what that money was spent on. You've purchased wine that's never appeared in our house. The room became absolutely silent. You've also transferred $18,000 from our savings account into an investment account that has only your name on it. An account I wasn't told existed. Emily's face went white. David cleared his throat uncomfortably. Linda stared at her hands folded in her lap. Maggie, George said, his voice taking on the patient tone he used when he thought I was being unreasonable. Those transfers were for our retirement security. I was trying to protect our assets. Our assets? I pulled out another document. This is the deed to our house, George. The house that's been in my name for 23 years. The house you've somehow managed to place in a trust that lists me as a dependent resident, rather than an owner. George's mouth opened and closed without sound. Mom, Emily said, her voice shaky now. I'm sure there's an explanation for all of this. Dad's always been good with finances. Maybe he was just trying to protect you. From what? I asked. From having access to my own money? From knowing how my own assets are managed? From having a say in decisions about my own life? I turned back to Linda, who was now staring at me with something that looked almost like respect. Linda, did you know that George was married when you started your friendship with him? Of course, she said quietly. Did you know that he was telling me I was imagining problems in our marriage while he was discussing those same problems with you? Linda's silence was answer enough. I reached into my folder one more time and pulled out a single sheet of paper. This morning, I opened my own bank account. Tonight, I'm moving half of everything in our joint accounts into that account. Money that my Social Security and part-time work contributed to our household. Mom, you can't just... Emily started. I can, I said firmly. And I am. I've also contacted a lawyer about the illegal transfer of assets from joint accounts into individual accounts without spousal notification. Apparently, that's called financial abuse. George stood up abruptly. Maggie, you're being dramatic. I was protecting our money. You were stealing my money, I said, and the word hung in the air like a blade. You were systematically removing my access to assets I'd helped build while conducting what amounts to an emotional affair with another woman. It's not an affair. George's voice rose to nearly a shout. We're friends. Companions. There's nothing physical. George, I said quietly, you don't get to define what constitutes betrayal in my marriage. You don't get to decide what hurts me. And you certainly don't get to gaslight me into believing that my reasonable expectations of fidelity and honesty are character flaws. I closed my folder and stood up. I'll be filing for legal separation on Monday morning. George, you have 30 days to find somewhere else to live. The house is mine, legally and morally. The money you transferred without my knowledge will be returned to joint accounts, or I'll pursue criminal charges for financial elder abuse. The room erupted. Emily jumped to her feet, her face flushed with anger. Mom, you're destroying our family over nothing. Dad made some financial decisions without consulting you. That doesn't make him a criminal. He stole from me, Emily, while lying to me, while carrying on an inappropriate relationship with another woman, while allowing both of you to convince me that my reactions to his behavior were evidence of my mental instability. David finally spoke. Margaret, maybe we should all take some time to cool down before making any permanent decisions. David, I said, looking at him directly, your mother has been having an affair with my husband, while you and Emily worked together to convince me I was crazy for noticing. There's nothing to cool down from. There's only truth to face. Linda stood up suddenly, her composure finally cracking completely. You self-righteous bitch, she snarled. George has been miserable with you for years. You're cold, You're boring. You're everything that drains the life out of a man. I gave him something you never could. Appreciation for who he actually is. The mask was finally off. Linda, I said calmly, you're welcome to him, but you'll have to support him on your own money, in your own house, without access to anything I've built. I picked up my purse and walked toward the door. Behind me, I could hear Emily crying, George pleading, David trying to restore order. Mom, please, Emily called. You're making a huge mistake. Dad loves you. I stopped at the door and turned back to look at them all. George disheveled and desperate, Emily tearful and angry, David uncomfortable and ashamed, Linda defiant but shaken. Emily, I said, your father had me sent away on a cruise so he could entertain another woman in our home. He's been stealing money from our joint accounts to fund a relationship he's been hiding from me. He's been allowing both of you to convince me that my reasonable objections to his behavior were evidence of mental illness. I paused, letting that sink in. If that's what love looks like to you, then I feel sorry for your marriage. I walked out the door and didn't look back. 3 weeks after the confrontation at Emily's house, I did something I hadn't done in 41 years of marriage. I painted a room in my house exactly the color I wanted, soft lavender. George had always hated purple in any form, calling it an old lady color. For 4 decades, our walls had been beige, cream, or the palest possible yellow, colors that offended no one and pleased no one. But standing in what used to be our bedroom, brush in hand, covering George's preferred classic khaki with moonlit lavender, I felt something I'd almost forgotten existed, joy in my own choices. The legal separation papers had been filed. George had moved out the day before his 30-day deadline, taking only what clearly belonged to him and leaving behind 23 years of shared life with surprising ease. He'd tried to negotiate for more time, more possessions, more sympathy. My lawyer, a sharp woman named Patricia Chen, who happened to be Rose's daughter, had shut down every manipulation attempt with surgical precision. Your husband has systematically isolated you financially while conducting an emotional affair, Patricia had said during our first meeting. In New York State, that's grounds for both divorce and restitution. He's lucky you're being as generous as you are. Generous. I was learning to redefine that word. I'd kept the furniture that mattered to me and donated the rest to a women's shelter. George's leather recliner, the one that had dominated our living room for 15 years, positioned for optimal television viewing regardless of how it affected the room's flow, went to Goodwill along with his collection of golf magazines and the exercise bike he'd used exactly 3 times. The living room, painted in warm, sunset peach, now contained furniture arranged for conversation and comfort rather than sports viewing. 2 comfortable chairs angled toward each other with a small table between them for teacups and books. A reading lamp that provided actual light instead of mood lighting. Plants. Real ones that I'd chosen because they made me happy, not because they required minimal care. Rose visited often during those first weeks, bringing Chinese takeout and practical advice in equal measure. She taught me how to use online banking, how to set up automatic bill payments, how to track my expenses and plan my budget without requiring anyone else's permission or oversight. Financial independence isn't just about money, she'd said one evening as we sat in my newly arranged living room. It's about making decisions from choice rather than desperation. When you know exactly what you can afford, you stop accepting unacceptable situations just because you're afraid of being unable to survive without them. My first independent decision was to enroll in that watercolor class I'd wanted to take 20 years earlier. The community center's Art for Adults program met Tuesday evenings and Saturday mornings in a bright studio overlooking the town park. I'd driven past that building hundreds of times, always promising myself I'd look into classes. Someday when I had more time. Someday had finally arrived. You've never painted before? Asked Marcus, the instructor, a gentle man in his 60s with paint-stained fingers and eyes that sparkled when he talked about color theory. Not really, I admitted. My family always said it was impractical. A waste of time and money. Marcus handed me a brush and smiled. Margaret, the only thing impractical about art is trying to live without it. The first stroke of blue across white paper felt like a prayer. Tentative, hopeful, full of possibility. I painted clouds that looked more like cotton balls and trees that resembled green lollipops. But something in my chest loosened with each imperfect brushstroke. "Don't think so much," Marcus said gently during my third class. "Let the color tell you what it wants to become." I laughed. "I've spent my entire life thinking about what other people wanted things to become. I'm not sure I know how to listen to what I want." "Practice," he said simply. "Like everything else worth doing, it just takes practice." The other students in the class were mostly women around my age, many of them recently divorced or widowed. We formed an unlikely friendship around our shared inexperience and mutual encouragement. Janet was learning to paint after her husband's death the previous year. Susan had always wanted to try art, but her ex-husband had said it was messy and pointless. Carol was celebrating her 70th birthday by taking every class she'd ever wanted to take. "I figure I've got maybe 20 good years left," Carol said one Saturday morning as she mixed colors for a landscape that looked like nothing found in nature. "I'm not wasting any more time on things that don't make me happy." 20 good years. The phrase stuck with me as I drove home that day. What did I want to do with 20 good years? What had I been postponing that I could finally pursue? I started small. I bought books I wanted to read instead of the bestsellers George preferred. I tried restaurants that served cuisine I was curious about rather than the sports bars George favored. I went to movies in the middle of the afternoon, sitting alone in dark theaters and eating popcorn for dinner without anyone telling me it wasn't a proper meal. The silence in my house had transformed from lonely to peaceful. I could hear birds singing outside my kitchen window. When had they started singing? Or had I simply been too busy managing everyone else's noise to notice? I played music I enjoyed instead of the conservative talk radio that had provided constant background commentary on everything wrong with the world. One evening in early November, as I was hanging my latest painting attempt, a sunset that looked like a child's interpretation of fire, my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw a young woman I didn't recognize holding a covered dish. "Mrs. Morrison?" she said when I opened the door. "I'm Sarah Kim. I live 3 houses down with my husband and our baby. Rose Chen told me you might enjoy some company for dinner." Rose, it turned out, had been quietly building a network of neighborhood women who checked on each other, shared meals, and provided the kind of community support that I'd never realized I was missing. Sarah was new to the area, struggling with isolation while her husband traveled frequently for work. Linda, an elderly widow 2 streets over, had mobility issues that made grocery shopping difficult. Maria, recently divorced, was raising 3 children alone while working 2 jobs. "We're not a formal group or anything," Sarah explained as we shared her homemade Korean dumplings in my sunset-colored living room. "Just people who realize that we don't have to manage everything alone. We don't have to manage everything alone." Such a simple concept, yet revolutionary for someone who'd spent decades believing that asking for help was evidence of weakness. Through this informal network, I learned that Mrs. Patterson, my elderly neighbor, had been having her mail stolen and was too embarrassed to report it. I learned that the young mother across the street was struggling with postpartum depression and needed someone to watch her toddler while she attended therapy appointments. I learned that the teenage boy who mowed my lawn was saving money for college and would appreciate additional odd jobs. For the first time in my adult life, I was part of a community that saw me as a person with value to contribute rather than just needs to be managed. In December, Emily called. "Mom." Her voice was smaller than I'd heard it in years. "I wanted to invite you to Christmas dinner." The invitation that would have once filled me with guilty obligation now required careful consideration. "Will your father be there?" I asked. "No. We're not really speaking to Dad right now. Linda broke up with him last month when she realized he didn't actually have as much money as she thought. Turns out when he couldn't access your assets anymore, his financial situation looked a lot less attractive. I felt no satisfaction in Linda's departure, no vindication in George's apparent financial struggles. I felt only a deep sadness for the waste of it all. "Will you expect me to cook?" I asked. "No, Mom. I'm cooking. Well, David and I are cooking together. We want to try to do things differently. And will you expect me to pretend that the last few months didn't happen? Will you want me to act grateful and avoid mentioning anything unpleasant?" There was a long pause. "No, Mom. I think I think we owe you some apologies and some honest conversations about how we've treated you, Emily, I said gently. I'm not ready for that yet. I'm still learning how to have honest conversations with myself. When I'm ready to hear your apologies, I'll let you know. Another pause. Can I ask, are you happy? Without us, I mean. Are you okay? I looked around my lavender bedroom, at the easel in the corner where my latest painting waited for tomorrow's work, at the stack of library books on my nightstand, at the window that overlooked the garden I was planning to completely redesign in spring. Emily, I said, I'm discovering what happiness looks like when it's not dependent on everyone else's approval. It's different than I expected. But yes, I think I'm going to be more than okay. After we hung up, I made myself a cup of tea and sat in my reading chair with one of the novels I'd been meaning to read for years. Outside, snow was beginning to fall, covering the world in clean white silence. For the first time in my adult life, I had nowhere I had to be, no one I had to please, no role I had to perform. I was simply Margaret Morrison, 63 years old, learning to paint watercolors and discovering what her own voice sounded like when no one was telling her to lower it. Tomorrow, I would attend Marcus's holiday art show where 3 of my paintings would be displayed alongside work by my classmates. Next week, I would start volunteering at the women's shelter where some of my donated furniture had found new homes. In spring, I would plant a garden full of flowers I loved instead of vegetables that were more practical. I realized as I turned the page of my book, finally learning how to live my own life, and it was beautiful. 6 months later, I stood on the deck of another cruise ship, watching the Manhattan skyline fade into the distance. But this time, everything was different. This time, I had chosen to go. Rose stood beside me at the rail, her silver hair whipping in the ocean breeze as she pointed out landmarks she remembered from her childhood in Brooklyn. My grandmother used to tell me that the ocean was where old stories went to be washed clean, she said. I never understood what she meant until I was 68 years old. We were part of a group of 12 women from our art class, celebrating the completion of our first year together with a week-long painting cruise to Bermuda. Marcus had organized the trip, promising workshops on capturing ocean light and painting seascapes that didn't look like angry gray soup. I'd hesitated when he first mentioned it. The idea of another cruise brought back memories of that devastating discovery 6 months earlier. But Sarah, my neighbor who'd become one of my closest friends, had put her hand on my arm and said something that changed my perspective entirely. Margaret, you can't let their betrayal steal the ocean from you too. The water doesn't belong to them. Your joy doesn't belong to them. Take it back. So here I was, taking it back. My cabin was small but comfortable, and for the first time in my life I was sharing it by choice rather than obligation. Carol, my 70-year-old classmate who was fearlessly pursuing every dream she'd deferred, was my roommate. She snored softly and left her art supplies everywhere and talked constantly about color theory, and sharing space with her felt like a gift rather than an imposition. Margaret, she'd said that first night as we unpacked our painting supplies, do you ever think about all the years we wasted being afraid of taking up space? I did think about it, often, but I was learning to frame those thoughts differently. Not as years wasted, but as preparation for who I was becoming. The dining room that had once felt like a monument to my loneliness now buzzed with conversation and laughter as our group shared meals together. We were an eclectic bunch: retired teachers, former nurses, women who'd raised children and buried husbands and survived divorces, and decided that whatever years remained belonged to us. Janet, my old friend who'd found me at that laundromat during my darkest hour, had joined us for the trip. I've been watching you bloom like a flower that finally got moved to the right soil, she told me over dinner the second night. It's been remarkable to witness. Bloom. I liked that word. It suggested something that had always been potential, just waiting for the right conditions to flourish. On the third day, as I stood at my easel on the ship's deck, trying to capture the way morning light turned the water into liquid gold, my phone buzzed with a message from Emily. Mom, I know you said you weren't ready to talk, but I wanted you to know that David and I are in marriage counseling. We're learning about emotional manipulation and gaslighting. I'm learning about how I learned to treat you. I'm so sorry. I hope someday you'll let me apologize properly. I read the message twice, then set my phone aside and returned to my painting. The apology would come when I was ready to receive it, and I was learning that my readiness mattered just as much as her need to give it. George had tried calling several times over the past months, but I'd let all his calls go to voicemail. The messages followed a predictable pattern. First anger at my unreasonable demands, then promises to change, then attempts to negotiate a reconciliation that would somehow restore his access to my assets without requiring him to acknowledge his betrayal. Patricia, my lawyer, had handled all necessary communication about the divorce proceedings. Financial restitution had been arranged. Property had been divided. The legal dissolution of our 41-year marriage had been reduced to paperwork and court signatures. But the emotional healing, that was work only I could do. "You know what's fascinating about watercolors?" Marcus said during our morning workshop that day. "You have to embrace the accidents. The way paint bleeds beyond where you intended. The way colors mix in unexpected ways. Fighting against the medium's nature creates muddy, lifeless work. Learning to dance with it creates magic." I thought about that as I watched my sunset painting develop. The orange I'd intended had bled into the purple in ways I hadn't planned, creating colors that were more beautiful than anything I could have deliberately designed. Maybe that was true about life, too. Maybe the unexpected bleeds and color mixing were where the real beauty happened. That evening, as our group gathered on the deck for drinks and shared critique of the day's paintings, I found myself thinking about the woman I'd been 6 months earlier. The woman who'd sat alone in this same type of setting, crying into a pillow because she thought the ocean wouldn't hear. But the ocean had heard, and somehow it had carried my pain away and brought me back to itself transformed. "Margaret," Rose said, appearing beside me with 2 glasses of wine, "you've gotten quiet. What are you thinking about?" "I'm thinking about how different this feels," I said. 6 months ago, I would have been apologizing for taking up space on this ship. Tonight, I'm grateful for the space I'm filling. Rose smiled and clinked her glass against mine. To taking up space, I agreed. The final night of the cruise, I did something I'd never done before. I stood up in front of our group and spoke from my heart without rehearsing, without worrying about how I sounded, without seeking anyone's approval for my words. 6 months ago, I began. I thought my life was over. I thought I was too old to start again, too set in my ways to learn new ones, too damaged to ever trust my own judgment again. I looked around at the faces of women who'd become my friends, my community, my chosen family. You've all taught me that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be, that 63 isn't an ending. It's a beginning. I held up my final painting from the trip, a seascape that somehow captured both the turbulence of storm clouds and the promise of clear horizon beyond them. "This painting isn't perfect," I said. "The perspective is off. The colors are muddy in places. And if you look closely, you can see where I made mistakes and had to paint over them." I smiled, feeling tears of joy rather than sorrow for the first time in months. "But it's mine. I created it. And imperfect as it is, it represents something I never had before. The freedom to create something solely because it brings me joy." The applause that followed wasn't just for my painting. It was for the recognition that we all shared. That we'd spent too many years creating lives designed to make other people comfortable, and we were finally learning to create lives that made us happy. When we returned to New York, I had a decision to make. Emily had asked again if she could visit, if we could begin the process of rebuilding our relationship. George had left a message saying he was in therapy and wanted to make amends. I wasn't ready for George. I might never be ready for George. Some betrayals cut too deep, lasted too long, involved too much systematic cruelty to be healed by therapy and good intentions. But Emily was my daughter. She'd learned destructive patterns from her father, yes, but she was also actively working to unlearn them. And I was strong enough now to set boundaries, to have honest conversations, to refuse relationships that required me to pretend I hadn't been harmed. I invited Emily for coffee. Not a meal, not a long visit, just coffee in a public place where I could leave if the conversation became manipulative or harmful. She looked different when she walked into the cafe, smaller somehow, less certain. She'd lost weight, and there were lines around her eyes that I didn't remember. Mom, she said as she sat down across from me, you look amazing. I did look amazing. I'd learned to dress for myself rather than for invisibility. I wore colors that made me happy instead of colors that wouldn't draw attention. I carried myself like a woman who belonged in the world instead of one who was apologizing for taking up space in it. Thank you, I said simply. I've been in therapy for 3 months, Emily said without preamble, learning about enmeshment and emotional manipulation and the way children learn relationship patterns from their parents. I sipped my coffee and waited. I'd learned the power of silence, of letting other people fill uncomfortable pauses instead of rushing to smooth them over. I learned that I was taught to see you as a resource rather than a person, Emily continued, her voice growing smaller. That Dad trained me to think your needs were less important than everyone else's, and that your pain was something to be managed rather than addressed. It was a start. Not forgiveness yet, but acknowledgement, recognition, the beginning of truth. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry for sending you on that cruise so Dad could have an affair. I'm sorry for gaslighting you when you discovered it. I'm sorry for making you feel crazy when you were reacting normally to abnormal treatment. The words I'd needed to hear for months, but hearing them now, when I no longer needed them for my own healing, gave them a different quality. They were Emily's words, Emily's work, Emily's growth. I could receive them as gifts rather than desperate necessities. Thank you, I said. I appreciate you saying that. Do you think, Emily's voice wavered, do you think there's any chance we could rebuild our relationship differently this time? I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, saw not just the woman who'd hurt me, but the child I'd raised, the person who was capable of growth and change. I think, I said carefully, that we could try, with boundaries, with honesty, with the understanding that I'm not the same person I was 6 months ago, and our relationship can't be the same either. Emily nodded, tears streaming down her face. I'd like that. I'd like to learn who you really are when you're not taking care of everyone else. We talked for an hour, not about the past, but about the present, about my art classes and her therapy, about the books I was reading and the places I wanted to travel, about the life I was building that belonged entirely to me. When we parted, Emily hugged me, tentatively, respectfully, like someone who understood that physical affection was a privilege to be earned rather than a right to be taken. I love you, Mom, she said. I love you too, I replied. And for the first time in years, I also love myself. 3 weeks later, I received an unexpected letter. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting immediately. Inside was a single photograph. Me, at age 22, standing on a beach in Cape Cod during a vacation George and I had taken when we were dating. In the picture, I was laughing at something off camera, my hair wild from ocean wind, my face radiant with joy and possibility. On the back, George had written, I forgot this version of you existed. I'm sorry I helped her disappear. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was acknowledgement that the woman in that photograph, joyful, radiant, full of possibility, had been real, had been valuable, had deserved better than she got. I tucked the photograph into my art supplies and used it as inspiration for my next painting. A portrait of a young woman standing at the edge of an ocean, facing toward a horizon full of light. But this time, I painted her at 63 instead of 22, because I'd learned something crucial. You don't have to go back to who you were before the pain. You can become someone new, someone stronger, someone who carries both the scars and the wisdom they've earned. As I put the finishing touches on that painting, Rose called with news that made my heart sing. Margaret, she said, I've been thinking, what would you say to taking another trip? There's an art retreat in Tuscany next spring, just us women, painting vineyards and learning to make our own wine. Yes, I said without hesitation. Yes to Tuscany, yes to wine, yes to painting things that don't exist until we create them. Yes to taking up space, Rose added. Yes, I agreed, to taking up space. That night, I sat in my lavender bedroom, surrounded by paintings I'd created with my own hands, in a house that belonged entirely to me, planning adventures that existed solely for my own joy. And I thought about that woman on the cruise ship 6 months earlier, crying into her pillow because she thought no one could hear her pain. The ocean had heard. The ocean had carried her tears away and brought her home to herself. And now, finally, she was free. Have you ever felt invisible in your own life? Have you ever loved someone more than they loved themselves, only to discover they saw your love as weakness to exploit rather than a gift to treasure? Tell me in the comments. Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping yourself? If this story touched you, please like this video and subscribe to this channel. Because sometimes, the person who needs to hear about second chances, about the courage to start over, about the revolutionary act of putting yourself first, might be you, and you deserve to know that it's never too late to come home to yourself.